Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's Richard Holden. I'm president of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this event on exploring Indigenous research. We're very pleased to and grateful for partnering with AIATSIS on this, and I'd also like to acknowledge support of the following other organisations: the Australian Council of Learned Academies, the Australian Academy of Science, the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, and the Australasian Council of Deans, Social Sciences and Humanities. We're now going to play a brief acknowledgement of country video, and I welcome you putting in the chat the lands from which you are joining on today. For me, it's the Bidjigal people in the eastern suburbs of Sydney.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples.
The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
The Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands.
The Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing.
And all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters.
Physical and spiritual.
Through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded. We pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
I'll now introduce the first of our speakers, which is Carolyn Jeffries. Carolyn is the Assistant Director of the Indigenous Research Exchange, bringing experience from more than 20 years of working with cultural institutions across Australia. She's a non-Indigenous woman who has spent much of her life on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal peoples in and around the ACT. She's passionate about Indigenous data governance and returning knowledge to community. Carolyn is committed to working with research partners to refine and expand metadata records, improving the access and application of Indigenous knowledge. So without any further ado, Carolyn, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that very warm welcome, and thank you to the entire team for making this possible. It's been a really wonderful experience for us. So, as mentioned, my name is Carolyn and I'm the Assistant Director of the Indigenous Research Exchange team at the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. AIATSIS is Australia's only national institution focused exclusively on the diverse history, cultures and heritage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We now have two homes, the first pictured here being Mariga, located on the Acton Peninsula, and the second recently opened in Mbatwa, Alice Springs, to provide an interactive and engaging space for cultural knowledge. The AIATSIS mission is to tell the story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, create opportunities for people to encounter, engage with and be transformed by that story, support and facilitate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural resurgence and shape our national narrative. The successful delivery of this mission relies on the proper and ethical collection, management, access and use of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander data, and that's what we'll be speaking on today. First up, just a bit more information about the Indigenous Research Exchange and the work that we do to improve outcomes, programs and policies through better access to and translation of knowledge and data. Some of you may have had the opportunity to attend the AIATSIS Summit last week in Naarm, Melbourne. The theme this year was Celebrating Brilliance, Then and Now. Those of us lucky enough to attend were treated to presentations highlighting incredible research that inform innovations that will shape the future, backed with 65,000 years of First Nations knowledge and knowing. It was a really wonderful event. I hope some of you have been able to attend. The Indigenous Research Exchange supports the continuation of this research and showcases the complexity and diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's research and culture. The IRX was established in 2018 via an agreement with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and continues today under the National Indigenous Australians Agency. Its purpose is to connect people, data, ideas and evidence, and to make research findings more accessible, contestable and usable. This is achieved through the funding of Indigenous-led research projects and the development of the knowledge exchange platform Yumisabe. To date, we've funded over 30 Indigenous-led research projects across Australia. They've all have demonstrated linkages to closing the gap targets and research priorities identified by the Indigenous Research Advisory Board. Span a huge range of topics, including reconciliation, cultural continuity and transmission, health policy, nation building, sexuality, and access to justice. Their research outputs are also varied and demonstrate the many ways that data and knowledge can be translated and shared, increasing its accessibility and usability. So to demonstrate that, I will just give you a demonstration of the site. Grab that. Okay. So here is an example of one of our grantees, Breaking the Silence, an AI project for deaf mob. They were one of the presenters at our summit last week, and a really wonderful one at that, and a great opportunity for us to learn more. I'll use this opportunity to point out some of the features of the site that do increase that data governance. So you'll see that projects can be verified. So there are many projects on the site. We've got 350 odd on the site now. And where possible, we've been able to connect with those researchers and ask them to verify the additional metadata that we've added. So part of that metadata is the language group. So we've used AUSTLANG codes in order to map the researchers. I will show you the interactive map in just a moment. Project contacts, supporting partners, and then these topics. These topics were developed through consultation with policymakers, Indigenous researchers, many of our grantees, and there was a lot of thought put into that to consider how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will be looking for this information to make it as relevant and findable as possible. Then you can see we've got the closing the gap focus and Indigenous involvement. Again, I'll go into more detail on those later, but one of the things is once you get into these sites, you can then click into the focus and go looking for other projects with that same tag. So we're hoping that this will help drive policymakers to the site as well. So I'll go back. Okay. So Yumisabe is a Creole term used across the northern stretch of Australia, meaning we know or we have the knowledge. Yumisabe provides a point of access to data and information at a local level, forming an evidence base for community-led decision-making and for governments to deliver more effective programs and policies. Making this knowledge more findable, especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander decision-makers, requires multiple cataloguing and tagging options. And as I say, they're all developed with much consultation. Going back to the interactive map. Somehow. So here you can see that we've currently got about 123 projects of the 358 that have been mapped. So that means that an Indigenous language group has been able to be identified to the project. And it just gives people an opportunity to really find data and information for their mob. So if we scroll in, you can get closer and closer. And here is another example of one of our grantees. And so, yes, each project has a description of the project and then listed outputs. Great thing about the outputs is that it isn't just academic publications. We have podcasts, we have video, we have beautiful illustrations. There are many ways to translate and inform. And that's which has been really special for us to be able to see. Now you'll also, beg your pardon, see our Indigenous involvement pyramid here. So that gives you a quick visual of how the community was engaged in terms of the research. And then we've also included Indigenous involvement notes, which then further highlights the methodology used, which is really a really important part of this as well. Yumi Sabe will continue to be an evolving platform responding to community needs and feedback from users on their experiences. All this work feeds into Priority Reform 4 of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap set out in 2020. Under Priority Reform 4, all Australian governments have committed to improving access to data and information at a regional level, collecting, handling and reporting data at sufficient levels of disaggregation to be usable for local decision-making, and building the research capability of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organisations so that they can continue the important collection and translation of this knowledge. So, as I said, this currently hosts 358 research projects with over 650 outputs, and we're now looking for other Indigenous data custodians such as universities, research organisations and government agencies to add their knowledge to the platform. We're working on refining a bulk upload process for those of you who hold large catalogues of relevant data. But of course, uploading is only one part of the task. The bigger part is the cataloguing and metadata labelling that to this point has been completed by a fantastic team in the IRX. But as you can imagine, this is a huge task, especially for those of us who are coming to the project later after it's all completed. So it is really important for researchers and knowledge holders to participate and collaborate in that work. So the IRX is looking to engage with a variety of stakeholders to inform this next phase. So if you're interested in being involved, please do reach out to us. You can jump onto the website using that QR code there, or go to yumi-sabe.aiatsis.gov.au and either click on the Contact Us form or email us at yumisabe@aiatsis.gov.au. We're very keen to work together. This is a big piece of work, and we're looking forward to seeing more and more data going up there. Thank you. And I will pass on to Sarah.
And I will just jump in and do a quick, thank you so much, Carolyn, and I will just jump in and do a quick introduction for Sarah. Second speaker is Dr. Sarah Tompkins. Sarah is currently the Acting Director of the AIATSIS Education Team. Before joining AIATSIS as a research fellow in 2022, Sarah worked as a lecturer, tutor and researcher in education and cultural studies at the University of Sydney, the Australian Catholic University and Macquarie University. Her research interests include anti-racist education, cross-cultural knowledge production and research ethics. Her work in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander educational research space is grounded in her identity as a white woman. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you to you and your team, Bonnie and others, for having us today. We're really excited to have this opportunity to share some of the work AIATSIS does and offer everyone in attendance some additional tools to engage with Indigenous research. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the AIATSIS guide and code of ethics. So the formal name is the AIATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. Many of you may be familiar with these guidelines and with the code itself, but I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining the rationale for it and then going through some of the principles. So again, for some of you, this might be really familiar, but I'm hoping for some people this will be an introduction to some of the principles that can help guide our research in this space. And in a really exciting way, when we go through this code, you'll see how the project Carolyn's described in Miss Survey exemplifies a lot of the principles in the Code of Ethics. So the specificity of ethical issues associated with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research is an area that's historically been misunderstood, neglected, and often even ignored. Despite the distinct and pressing ethical concerns that exist in this space, along with the fact that all the research that takes place in Australia is taking place on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, the pattern of considering Indigenous ethics solely as a specialised, siloed field is insufficient for developing nuanced, quality and responsible Australian research. While key Australian research ethics frameworks, notably the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research and the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, provide solid guidance around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, the AIATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research provides the most substantial framework for researchers in this area. The purpose of the AIATSIS Code is to promote ethical practice, to increase the contributions of Indigenous knowledge to Australian research, to ensure research has a positive impact for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and to continuously improve the quality and standard of research in this area. On the next slide, we can see that the AIATSIS Code is also accompanied by a guide to applying the AIATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. And that document's really great because it provides practical advice for researchers on the way the code itself can inform everything from project design through to project implementation, communication of results, and also post-project work. So I'm going to be talking about the code in a way that is grounded in the principles that can inform research, but a lot of people may have encountered the code when they went through or considered going through the AIATSIS HREC, the Human Research Ethics Committee. My big encouragement to everyone here today is that even if your project doesn't need HREC approval, or doesn't need HREC approval through AIATSIS, or isn't even explicitly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, the principles in this code can enhance all research projects. And every bit of research in Australia, I think, should be actively engaging with these principles for to ensure you're doing work that is culturally responsible and responsive, but also I believe it creates better research more broadly. So on the next slide, we can see that one of the major principles that drives AIATSIS Code of Ethics is this concept of Yinjamara. The AIATSIS Code embraces Yinjamara as its guiding principle to ethical research, to emphasise the significance of considering respect and impact in research. Yinjamara is not only about treating the research and its participants with honour and respect, but is also about the researcher themselves acting with integrity in relation to themselves and others. This broadly connects to the national statement's conceptualisation of ethical conduct, which is positioned, and I'm quoting the national statement here, as more than simply doing the right thing. It involves acting in the right spirit out of an abiding respect and concern for one's fellow creatures. So therefore, acting with integrity is about cultivating a particular mindset towards research rather than simply following procedures and well-trodden pathways. So it's thinking about conduct over compliance. In this way, integrity is about accountability across a range of domains. So accountability to your participants, to communities, to knowledge systems and governance structures, as well as to researchers themselves. This focus on integrity as a non-Indigenous researcher I found really helpful because it's helped me navigate the complexities of my involvement in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research and helped me invest in the ongoing process of developing my cultural capability. So in the next slide, you can see a graphic which represents the Code of Ethics and its 4 principles. And importantly, you can see at the core of this is integrity, which I've just described through the concept of Yinjamara. So I'm going to spend the next 5 or so minutes touching upon what each of these principles mean. Again, for some of you, this is going to be a very understood space. For others, I really encourage you to get a copy of the Code of Ethics, which you can download from our website, and doing a deeper dive, because I'm just going to be kind of scratching the surface in regards to the 4 principles and the associated responsibilities. So the first principle of the AIATSIS Code, which is Indigenous self-determination, emphasises the significance of incorporating Indigenous self-determination in all research. So this is very much aligned with things around Indigenous self-determination as articulated in UNDRIP, for example. The AIATSIS Code unpacks self-determination in research through 4 key responsibilities, which you can see up on the screen. The responsibility of recognition and respect is about understanding the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations, communities, cultures, and experiences. For researchers to demonstrate their understanding of this, they have the responsibility to embed localised and place-based approaches to their research that respond to the knowledge of country and communities. The process in which researchers must do this, moving down the list of responsibilities, is through meaningful engagement and collaboration with the respective Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations, communities and experts. This approach must be maintained through the life of the project and be appropriate to the aims, priorities and impacts of the research. In engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, research must recognise and respect both individual and collective or community rights through free, prior and informed consent. The AIATSIS Code emphasises the need to ensure that individual informed consent processes are appropriate and responsive to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants. And importantly, it really stresses the need to consider collective consent. And that could be something like engaging with community decision-making structures, for example. Rigorous, culturally responsive informed consent is a key way of incorporating this first principle of self-determination in research, so that researchers are ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collective rights and interests are upheld. And the final responsibility in this first principle is cultural capability and learning, which encourages researchers to consider potential knowledge gaps and systematic biases that are often overlooked when designing and planning research. The second principle is Indigenous leadership. When considering research merit and integrity, Principle 2 requires researchers to prioritise Indigenous leadership. In line with Principle 1 of self-determination, the responsibility of Indigenous-led research ensures that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research factors in decision-making and rights-based approaches to establishing research programs and agendas. Indigenous-led research assists researchers with aligning the priorities and objectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, communities and nations to their work. And prioritising Indigenous leadership is also about applying Indigenous perspectives and participation, which you can see as the second responsibility there. The code requires researchers to shift from abstracted and objectified Western paradigms and reference points of knowledge towards privileging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander epistemologies and interdisciplinary thinking. And then the final responsibility there is Indigenous knowledge and data, which Yume Sabe exemplifies. And this responsibility is looking to establish the ways in which research projects embed Indigenous data sovereignty and governance principles in the collection, interpretation, and dissemination of research. Principle 3, impact and value. This is responding to the problematic extractive research that doesn't give back to Indigenous communities and instead thinks about centering benefit and reciprocity and impact and considering impact and risk. The AIATSIS code prompts researchers to think about benefit in the broader sense, so not just about paying Indigenous participants in a fair and equitable way, but also considering how we can provide benefit to Indigenous people for the contributions in terms of time, knowledge, and resources that they contribute to research projects. Furthermore, the code requires researchers to reflect on impact and provide honest, justifiable, and realistic statements of the potential or actual impact that research may have on community partners and individuals, particularly when assessing and explaining risk. This needs to be done with a cultural lens and to think about both individual and community or collective risk. And the fourth and final principle is sustainability and accountability, which requires researchers to consider the impact of research on country, both in terms of environmental sustainability and tangible cultural heritage, but also the impact on culture, intangible cultural heritage and community as a whole. Additionally, the responsibility of ongoing Indigenous governance mandates that researchers consider post-project management of data and knowledge. And this lines up with Principle 2 of Indigenous leadership and thinks about ongoing governance arrangements that are done in consultation with community and community leaders. And that means that data after research is finished can be accessed and used in ways that uphold the priorities and rights of those involved. And then our final responsibility, reporting and compliance, rounds out the responsibilities in the code, and this is focused on ensuring that the administrative requirements, and the lights have gone out in the room, and monitoring of research is useful both in form and function. So that's the code. I'm hoping that people will download a copy and have a closer read of that, and also a copy of our guide. If you'd like any further information on the AIATSIS HREC in particular, which assesses applications for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, we have some resources up here, and specific questions for our Secretariat of our HREC can be directed to ethics@iatsis.gov.au. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So our final speaker, Colin, is the project lead for e-learning in the AIATSIS education team. He's a Mununjali man whose family is from the Bow Desert region in southeast Queensland. He's a long-term public servant with 30 plus years of experience in the Indigenous programs areas, delivering employment, education, and facilitating remote community services. He is currently leading the modernisation and updating of the AIATSIS core e-learning products. Welcome, and over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Richard, Bonnie and your team for this opportunity. In this section, I will provide an overview of core ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, focusing on the development of the module, as well as its learning objective, content, and user experience. On the next slide, This module was created in partnership with the University of Sydney and the University of Queensland. The impetus for this partnership and project was a recognition by AIATSIS and our university partners that training in research ethics is in demand across the university sector. In particular, there is a clear need for training that addresses the specific history and issues related to ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. Over the last 2 years, the project partners have worked together to develop core ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, an innovative, interactive e-learning module. This module directly addresses the identified need for this sort of training in a culturally responsive and engaging way that will make important contributions to changing research practice in higher education. This is a commercial product with organisational licences starting at the numbers of 10. My colleague Daniela, who I prepared earlier, will be available to discuss any commercial questions later on. The next slide is to show you that the module is based on 2 key documents shown here on screen that Sarah outlined and gave a little bit of detail on. On the next slide, as shown in this screenshot, the key learning objectives of the module are to establish the importance of ethics or acting with integrity and the concept of Injamara when approaching Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander research. Develop researchers' understanding of research ethics governance in Australia, provide researchers with an in-depth exploration of the 4 principles that make up the AIATSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. Encourage researchers to reflect on their own identity, research practices, and research projects. On the next slide, this slide lists the module's 9 units, which are delivered across 2 2-hour blocks of learning. Unit 1 provides an introduction and welcomes researchers to the module. Unit 2 examines the complex and often difficult history of research about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and topics. Reflecting on this history, as well as on its ongoing impacts, is an important starting point for this module, as engaging with this context is vital for understanding ethical and culturally safe research. Unit 3 explores the significance of self-reflexivity in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. This unit is designed to empower researchers to think about their own positionality, and make culturally responsive decisions based on this understanding. Unit 4 provides an overview of the Australian research ethics governance landscape. Units 5 to 8 then provide a deep dive, including case studies and practical guidance into the 4 principles that make up the AIATSIS Code of Ethics. Unit 9 concludes the module, allowing researchers to reflect on the interconnectedness of these 4 principles and also directly consider the impact of their learning in this module on their own future practices. The next slide. The module was built in Articulate Rise, a leading platform in the e-learning space, known for its strong user experience and accessibility. In terms of engagement and interactivity, the module features a variety of media, including videos, both commissioned for this module and external videos used with permission. These multiple media sources ensure that strong Indigenous voices are centred throughout the module. The next the next page, sorry about that. The module also features over 25 case studies and examples from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers and communities across Australia. This includes, but is not limited to, case studies from our project partners, such as this example of a research partnership between the Indigenous people and scientists from the University of Queensland's Australian Institute of Bioengineering and Nanotechnology. This example is used to assist researchers to reflect on issues of community research benefit. The next slide. Additionally, the module features opportunities for learners to test their knowledge and also to reflect on their learning. It is accompanied by a workbook where researchers can use to critically reflect on their learning and its implications for their own practice. And finally, the final slide. Thank you. For further information, you can go to our website, the AIATSIS.gov.au in the education section, or you can email us at call@aiatsis.gov.au with any queries that we can follow up on your behalf. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Colin. We'll now move to the Q&A portion of the event. First question we have, and I'll let the speakers figure out who's the best person or the best set of people to answer those. Colin has views already, so there we go. The first question, is the code mandatory for state and statutory bodies such as the Department of Education and local Aboriginal land councils? If not, why not?
This is an excellent question, and one we get a lot. And Core for Ethics, which Colin talks about, spends a lot of time unpacking the Australian research ethics governance landscape to think about the relationship between the Australian Code, the National Statement, and the AIATSIS Code. There's no obligation in terms of HRECs for any research project that's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, for example, to come through the AIATSIS HREC, which is the only national specialised Indigenous HREC in Australia. Many university HRECs will have specialisation from one or two members of the HREC around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. And I noticed the person who asked the question, sorry, I've forgotten the name already, but came from a government department as well. So there's no mandating for researchers doing human research to apply the code. But there definitely is requirements in the national statement, for example, that require researchers to consider Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander impact, risk, sustainability, that type of thing. But the big kind of frameworks, the Australian Code and the National Statement, don't go as far as the AIATSIS Code. We would love to see every researcher applying it. And our big encouragement, which I said in my section, is that even if researchers aren't obligated to apply it or are doing something like textual analysis that doesn't necessarily require HREC approval, that the principles can inform research to make it more culturally responsive and overall enhance the quality of the research. Don't know if anyone wanted to add anything else from my team.
Thanks, Sarah. That was from Anonymous. You mentioned the name, so we don't have the name there, but I will try and read out people's names from those who've offered them in the chat. And of course, you can put it in anonymously if you'd prefer to do that. So the next question is from Tufam, who asks, how can we best apply the responsibilities diagram to address the question/requirement in the ethics application for an AIATSIS research project?
I might take this again. The big thing I would encourage, and I've done this when I've had to go through HREC for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research, is look at the Code of Ethics, the AIATSIS Code, but also look at the guide to applying the code, because that gives you a lot of guidance around practical issues. So, for example, our ethics secretariat will often get questions about, in the code it says, for example, that you need to get community support for your research. But then the question we get from researchers, which is a very fair one, what constitutes research? What constitutes community support from a HREC perspective? And that's kind of a shifting question within HRECs across Australia. So it used to be a very kind of formalised process where support had to be indicated through letters that had to be on a community organisation letterhead, but there's been shifts around emails and kind of other forms of informal evidence that can indicate community support. So often when we're talking about getting an application through a HREC, there's not always hard and fast rules, but the guide to applying the AIATSIS Code of Ethics, as well as our ethics website, will give you kind of tangible advice on some of the big things, which is often around community support, co-design, and other things like that. We also have examples of how you can get informed consent and create participant information statements and forms in culturally responsive ways as well. Thanks for that question.
Terrific. The next question is from Lisa, who has a chapter drawing from qualitative research from young people recently released from Youth Justice Detention in New South Wales about their experiences. Lisa says the project was overseen by the New South Wales Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council Ethics Committee, but the chapter's now locked away in a very inaccessible and expensive book. She's disappointed that these important narratives of the young people involved can't be accessed more easily so that their stories can be heard. If she was to successfully seek permission from the publisher, would there be the possibility of reproducing the chapter within the Umisabe platform with a link to the book maintained?
Yeah, fantastic question, and a great example of where data and knowledge can come from. It's not, as I say, not just academic research. And that part of the issue is that so much is locked behind paywalls or subscriptions. So it is really important to get that back. If you are able to get permission, then absolutely, we'd love to see that. Keeping in mind, the other option is we can also offer to be a signpost, so that if the publisher does have any concerns, what we can do is you can still create a project page and then link where to find the book. And that in itself may inspire them to make that more accessible when they see that a lot of people are looking for that information. As where we can publish the work on the site, that's fantastic, but at the very least we'd love to be a signpost for all work that's been done. So yeah, please reach out. Love to hear how we can help out with that.
Thanks so much. Noella has a question that many others may have as well, just asking who to contact for access to the course for trainees, the course that Colin was talking about. So I think Daniela might be the person for that. So can I hand over to you and we could possibly pop those details in the chat or something like that?
Of course you can. So my name's Daniela and I look after the licensing of the core e-learning suite. The best place, I'll put it in the chat for you. So it's core@aiatsis.gov.au. We can have a chat from there and we can look at the possibilities for your organisation and getting demonstration access to the course as well. So that way you can have a good look and see if it's fit for purpose for your organisation.
Thanks, Daniela. Matt asks, outside of universities, for example, in government research, when would it be necessary to submit to an ethics committee?
Very good question. And a question our secretariat of our HREC would probably get at least once a week. And this is something that's explored in core ethics as well. What constitutes research is the first question. And then what constitutes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research is kind of the second question. And then we also have questions around when do processes around co-design and evaluation require a HREC approval. So there's kind of a couple of things going there. I'll reinforce my point that I imagine everyone on this Zoom call is on board with, but even if we don't need HREC approval, we can apply the principles in the AIATSIS Code of Ethics. And then to the question of when is HREC approval needed, you can make kind of some general comments, but I know there is a lot of grey area. And the best way is to reach out to our ethics secretariat, which is just ethics@aiatsis.gov.au. and Lisa and the ethics team can have a kind of preliminary look at your project, look at the scope of it. Does it constitute human research? And then is it also something that has enough kind of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content to get value of going through the AIATSIS rec? But I think every bit of research that takes place in Australia should be considering these, because it's taking place on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. So even if the majority of participants aren't Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, even if it isn't explicitly dealing with Indigenous knowledge systems, I think the very fact that we're in Australia and we're doing research means that our research can be enhanced, and indeed there's a necessity to consider the principles. So that's a very wishy-washy answer in a way, but it's an acknowledgement that there is some grey area around what should go through a HREC, and I'd encourage you to either have a look at core ethics, which will help you step yourself through that question in relation to your project, or contact us on that email address.
Louise asks whether HREC has the capacity to review more research applications, particularly health research.
Hi everybody, Lisa from the Research Ethics Secretariat. So we, the committee meets at least 8 times a year, and if we, there's a limit on how much they can do in a day, but if we get more applications, then we can expand how long the meetings go for, or there is opportunities. At a recent committee meeting, the committee was quite concerned about the number of health ones that were coming to us, because we're not health, our committee members are not health specialists. So going forward, anything that's health related will actually be reviewing before it goes to the committee, because it may actually be more appropriate that it goes to the NHMRC, or rather than to us. So, does that help?
Great, thank you. I'm going to combine 2 questions here, one from Bronwyn and one from Anthony. They're both around timeframes to do, in a sense, and sometimes burdens on Indigenous researchers to do with the process. So Bronwyn asks and says, it's great to ask non-Indigenous researchers to demonstrate cultural capability, reciprocity and safety. However, for us Indigenous researchers taking a participatory action, research methodology using culturally appropriate methods such as yarning, ethics application can actually act as a barrier to Indigenous-led research. How does your ethics approach empower Indigenous-led researchers getting through the process? And Anthony says, curious to understand how the framework balances the need to go slow with the sometimes inevitable pressures of external deadlines and tight research timelines.
Yeah, such a good question, both of those. Something that we all grapple with. We obviously work in a government institution with timelines and expectations from external people, but obviously are all very invested in some of these principles that rightly take time and thought and changing tacks and going back. So there is a real tension between these governance structures and kind of best practice that empowers Indigenous communities to have the research partnerships that they want that empower their communities. So I think that's a big tension with no easy answers. The only thing I can say is that from sitting in on many of these HREC meetings, our HREC, which is majority Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, doesn't blindly read applications with no understanding about who the researchers are, what the communities are asking for in terms of engagement. And there's a lot of discussion about cultural load, which that first question alluded to. And there's no easy answers. In a way, I think the code supports non-Indigenous researchers more, because for someone like me as a non-Indigenous person, there's so much more cultural capability that I have to develop in this space. And the code does acknowledge, and the HREC does acknowledge, that Indigenous researchers engaging with the code or engaging with our HREC have so much more lived community experience that they bring to the process. And so, for example, if there was a majority non-Indigenous research team versus a majority Indigenous community research team, the HREC is going to apply different standards of what constitutes letters of support, for example, or what informed consent can look like if it's people coming from outside of community versus community researchers. So one of our dreams that Col and I have talked about is creating a core for ethics for community researchers, because as the two questions rightly point out, considerations for someone doing research as a non-Indigenous person versus an Indigenous person, for doing research within government or university versus research within community or community organisations. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Thanks, Sarah. An anonymous participant asks, are there any particular codes or guidelines for community engagement that might not necessarily be for research purposes, or is the AIATSIS Code of Ethics broad enough to be applied for community engagement purposes as well?
Well, it's not a standalone independently for consultations. It's aimed at researchers. The actual principles could be applied to any work, really. Yeah.
And that's a really good point. So, for example, I actually sit in the education team, and we were doing community consultation on a set of resources about massacre for high school students. And we went out at the community's request to a hall and ran a consultation session. And we deliberately applied principles of the Code of Ethics to how we ran that session, in terms of talking to the participants about what was going to happen in the session, how we were going to use their feedback. So it definitely didn't constitute research, and it definitely didn't constitute something that needed to go through a HREC. But by explicitly leaning on the Code of Ethics, we were like ensuring that that kind of informal consultation did exemplify the principles and help us kind of act with integrity and kind of guide us in that example.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. I've tried to get to most of them, but and some of them were in common. But of course, people are welcome to follow up, and contact details are certainly available. But this last question is, how do Indigenous researchers working for government agencies protect their own knowledge while doing research?
I don't know the answer to that. That's that tension we talked about, right? Like, how does formal research sit alongside the fact that everyday Indigenous people and communities are generating new knowledge about themselves, about their communities, about their knowledge systems? And I've definitely had conversations with Col, who's been in the public service for over 30 years, about navigating kind of an institutional space along with your kind of own community affiliations.
Community interactions, different set of norms, but still maintaining expectations of a government agency in delivering and identifying and doing effectively, and modelling in a way that can go forward with the future and build stepping stones on what comes next, instead of the same flat line, no results sort of situation. So there's always constant developing, evolving, people becoming more aware and more accepting of the ways that are occurring, and respectful. The respect is, which is a main tenet of the ethics. Being respectful, and it's being picked up on both sides. So it's actually working very well. And it's taken years to come into place, the respect coming from a position of non-respect from certain parts of society in the 40s and 50s, even earlier, right up to today, is a major difference in my lifetime alone. So, yeah.
And it's probably things using tactics and strategies like engaging with the platform like UNISABE. So doing the kind of conventional government or university research, but thinking about kind of innovative ways of disseminating the research back to community and back to other Indigenous researchers. So doing the kind of stock standard research that we do within institutions, but the code encourages this to be innovative about how we disseminate and share data. And I think those processes are one way that we can start to empower Indigenous researchers to use community knowledge in a way that enhances their own agency and gets the data to do the work that we want it to do, which is make change and address some of the systemic issues that we've alluded to as well.
We'll need to wrap up given time, but thank you very much first to all the speakers, Carolyn, Sarah and Colin, and thank you very much to the audience as well for coming and engaging and being part of this event. Let me remind you that a recording will be sent to each of you via email. And I'd like to just briefly share a couple of things before we close. One is that our decadal plan for social science research infrastructure, which was launched recently, and we'll pop a link to that in the chat, prioritises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's self-determination in social science research infrastructure planning. And also to mention that the Academy of Social Sciences Innovate Reconciliation Action Plan will be launching soon. So if you follow us on any of the socials and are interested, you can stay up to date with that. Thank you again to our speakers and to everyone for participating. And I appreciate you attending this important and very, very interesting event. Thank you so much.